In the bitter cold of January 1849, in the small settlement of Harlan's Creek, Kentucky, 8-year-old Thomas Farrow woke screaming from a dream that was not his own. His mother, Elizabeth, rushed to his bedside as she had done countless nights before. But this time was different. The boy's eyes were wide and lucid, not clouded with the remnants of a nightmare. He spoke with precision about places he had never seen, described people long dead with the intimacy of kinship, and recounted experiences that had occurred a century before his birth. "Mother," he whispered, his voice steady despite the tremor in his small hands. "I remember everything now. I remember being James Woodford. I remember dying in 1749. Elizabeth Farrow, a widow of 3 years and a woman of pragmatic faith, felt her blood run cold. The name Woodford carried weight in Harlan's Creek. The Woodford plantation stood abandoned on the outskirts of town, a decaying monument to one of the first families to settle the region. James Woodford had been its patriarch, a man whose legacy lived in local lore, but whose life had ended exactly 100 years prior during a violent conflict with neighboring tribes. By dawn, young Thomas had recounted details of colonial life that no child could have invented. The precise method for curing tobacco leaves used by early settlers, the names of trading outposts long abandoned, and the intricacies of colonial taxation that had driven men like Woodford west from Virginia. Most disturbing of all, he described the location of a hidden cellar beneath the abandoned Woodford home where, he claimed, important documents had been sealed away before James Woodford's death. Word spread quickly through Harlan's Creek. By midday, a small crowd had gathered outside the modest Farrow home. Among them was Dr. Elijah Covington, the town physician, and a man of scientific inclination who had studied in Philadelphia. The doctor had known Thomas since birth and had treated the boy through bouts of fever and childhood ailments. Nothing in the child's history suggested an explanation for this sudden transformation. "The boy speaks as if he lived it," whispered Sarah McDonough, the midwife who had delivered Thomas 8 years prior. "It ain't natural. It's like his soul's been replaced." Reverend Thaddeus Wright, pastor of the local Presbyterian church, pushed his way through the murmuring crowd. "The Lord works in ways we cannot comprehend," he announced, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his discomfort. "But we must be cautious that darker forces are not at work here." Elizabeth Farrow stood in her doorway, one arm around her son's shoulders. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes blazed with the protective ferocity of motherhood. "My son is not possessed," she stated firmly. "Something has happened to him that we do not understand, but Thomas is still Thomas." The boy looked up at his mother with gratitude, but his eyes reflected a confusion beyond his years. "I'm still me," he said softly, "but I also remember being him. I remember everything, his wife, his children, his fears. I remember how he died." Dr. Covington stepped forward, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hand. "Mrs. Farrow, I would like to examine the boy. Not as someone afflicted, but as someone experiencing something extraordinary." Inside the small cabin, the doctor examined Thomas with careful precision, checking his pupils, his pulse, the clarity of his lungs. Everything appeared normal. Then he began to question the boy about his memories, not with suspicion, but with methodical curiosity. "James Woodford died in December of 1749, the doctor noted, consulting a small notebook. "Can you describe the circumstances?" Thomas closed his eyes, his face contorting with pain that seemed incongruous on such young features. "It was cold, like now. There was snow. He was returning from a trading expedition. They were waiting in the forest, 3 men. They wanted the deeds to the Western Territories, the ones hidden in the cellar. And these deeds, they would be valuable? They proved ownership of 5,000 acres beyond the Cumberland Gap, land that would be worth a fortune as settlers pushed west." The boy's voice had changed subtly, adopting the cadence and vocabulary of an educated adult. "They killed him for those papers, but they never found them." Dr. Covington exchanged glances with Elizabeth. "And you believe these documents are still hidden in the Woodford plantation cellar?" The boy nodded slowly. in a lead box behind the third stone from the floor on the eastern wall. James sealed them there the day before he was killed, suspecting betrayal, but not knowing from whom. The gathering outside had grown larger, their murmurs rising like the buzzing of disturbed bees. Through the window, Elizabeth could see Reverend Wright addressing the crowd, his gestures suggesting both caution and concern. "What do you intend to do with this knowledge?" she asked the doctor quietly. Dr. Covington closed his notebook deliberately. "Science demands investigation, Mrs. Farrow. If what Thomas describes exists, it would suggest—" He trailed off, unwilling to articulate the impossible conclusion that evidence might support. "And if it does exist, what becomes of my son then? Will they see him as a miracle or a monstrosity?" The doctor had no answer for her. That night, after the curious and the concerned had finally dispersed, Elizabeth sat beside Thomas as he drifted toward sleep. His small face, usually peaceful in repose, was troubled. "I'm afraid, Mother," he whispered. "The memories feel like they're drowning me. James had a wife named Sarah and 3 children. I can feel how much he loved them. I can feel how desperate he was to return to them that night, and I can feel the knife." His voice broke. Elizabeth stroked his hair, her heart breaking for burdens no child should bear. "We'll find a way through this," she promised, though she had no idea how to fulfill such a pledge. As Thomas finally fell into restless sleep, Elizabeth remained by his side, watching the rise and fall of his chest and wondering what forces, divine or otherwise, had chosen her son as their conduit. Outside, the winter wind howled against the cabin walls, carrying the whispers of the town's speculation and fear. 100 yards away, barely visible through the swirling snow, stood the abandoned Woodford plantation, its darkened windows like eyes watching, waiting for secrets long buried to emerge into the light. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss what happens next in this extraordinary story of memory, history, and a mother's determination to protect her child from a town increasingly divided by fear and fascination. By the following morning, Harlan's Creek had transformed from a close-knit settlement into a community fractured by Thomas Farrow's inexplicable knowledge. Farmers gathering at Claude Peterson's general store debated whether the boy's condition was a divine message or a troubling affliction. Women exchanging recipes and town news by the community well lowered their voices when Elizabeth Farrow appeared to collect water, their sympathetic smiles failing to mask their unease. "It's not right for a child to speak as if he's lived a century," declared Millicent Hayworth, the blacksmith's wife and a woman whose opinions carried the weight of iron. "No good can come of entertaining such notions." But others disagreed. Jacob Miller, whose family had farmed the region for 3 generations, defended the boy. "My grandfather knew James Woodford, said he was a fair man and honest in his dealings. If young Thomas knows things only Woodford could know, perhaps the Almighty has his reasons." The debate might have remained theoretical had Thomas not insisted on visiting the abandoned Woodford plantation that afternoon. Elizabeth attempted to dissuade him, fearing the reaction of the townspeople, but the boy was uncharacteristically determined. "The answers are there, Mother. I can feel them pulling at me." Unable to deny the desperation in her son's eyes, Elizabeth relented. They departed shortly after midday, following the old trail that wound through frost-covered fields toward the weathered plantation house that stood on a low hill overlooking the creek. They had not traveled far when they realized they were being followed. Dr. Covington caught up with them at the crossroads, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I thought you might attempt this," he said without accusation. "I believe I should accompany you, for scientific documentation, of course." Elizabeth understood the unspoken offer of protection in his words and nodded her thanks. As they approached the abandoned property, they discovered they were not the only ones drawn to the Woodford plantation that day. Reverend Wright stood at the edge of the overgrown garden, accompanied by 3 elder members of his congregation. Their presence was not coincidental. "Mrs. Farrow," the Reverend called, his tone carefully balanced between concern and authority. "I must caution against encouraging this situation. The boy needs prayer and guidance, not indulgence." "What my son needs is understanding," Elizabeth replied evenly. If there are answers here that might help him, I have a mother's duty to seek them. Thomas, seemingly unaware of the tension between adults, walked with purpose toward the dilapidated house. Its windows were long broken, its paint peeled away by decades of Kentucky summers and winters. The front door hung askew, offering entrance to a place most local children had been warned to avoid. The cellar entrance isn't through the house, Thomas said with certainty. It was constructed separately, for storing tobacco and provisions. There, he pointed to an area behind the house where tall weeds had reclaimed what once had been a kitchen garden. Dr. Covington followed, notebook in hand, while Elizabeth and the reluctant church delegation trailed behind. Where Thomas indicated, partially hidden by overgrowth, was a weathered wooden door set at an angle into the ground, a typical root cellar entrance of colonial design. "It's locked," Thomas said, though no lock was visible on the deteriorated wood. "The key was kept..." He walked to a nearby oak tree and reached into a hollow barely visible in its massive trunk. His small hand emerged holding a rusted key of unusual design. Reverend Wright inhaled sharply. "This proves nothing. The boy could have found the key while playing here." "Thomas has never been to this property before," Elizabeth stated firmly. "We had no reason to visit." The key, despite its age, turned with surprising ease in the hidden lock. The cellar door creaked open, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. The smell of damp earth and forgotten space rose to meet them. Dr. Covington produced a lantern from his bag and lit it. "I came prepared," he explained, seeing Elizabeth's questioning look. The physician led the way down, followed closely by Thomas, whose movements displayed none of the hesitation one might expect from a child entering an unknown darkness. The cellar was larger than it appeared from outside, its walls constructed of fitted stone rather than the rough masonry common to the region. Wooden shelves, now mostly collapsed, lined the walls. In one corner stood a colonial writing desk, its surface covered with a century of dust. Thomas walked directly to the eastern wall. "Third stone from the floor," he murmured, counting carefully. The stone he indicated appeared no different from those surrounding it, but when Dr. Covington pressed against it as Thomas directed, it moved slightly, revealing a small cavity behind. The Reverend and his elders had followed them down, and now watched in stunned silence as Dr. Covington reached into the opening and withdrew a small lead box, tarnished black with age. The box was sealed, its lid decorated with an engraved compass rose design. "That's it," Thomas whispered. "The deeds and the letter." Dr. Covington handed the box to Thomas, whose small fingers traced the engraving with familiar reverence. "He commissioned this in Philadelphia," the boy said softly. "It was designed to be watertight and fireproof. The documents inside prove legitimate purchase of the territories from both the Crown and the Cherokee Nation." With trembling hands, Thomas opened the box. Inside, preserved by the airtight seal, were several folded parchments and a letter, the ink faded but legible. Dr. Covington carefully lifted the letter and read the heading aloud. "To whoever discovers this record, know that I, James Woodford, being of sound mind but in fear for my life, have concealed these deeds to protect my family's rightful claim." The date at the bottom of the letter was December 12, 1749, 3 days before James Woodford's documented death. "This is..." Dr. Covington began, but words failed him. Reverend Wright stepped forward, his face pale in the lantern light. "This is evidence that cannot be dismissed," he admitted reluctantly. "But it doesn't explain how the boy could know." Thomas looked up from the box, his expression troubled. "There's something else," he said. "Something James didn't write in the letter. He knew who wanted him dead. It was his business partner, William Harlan, the man this town is named after." The revelation hung in the damp air of the cellar like a physical presence. William Harlan was revered as the founder of Harlan's Creek, a pioneer whose courage and vision had established the settlement that grew into their community. His descendants still occupied positions of prominence in the county. "That is a serious accusation," Reverend Wright said stiffly. "One that cannot be made lightly against a family that has contributed so much to this region." "It's not an accusation," Thomas replied with a child's directness. "It's a memory." James discovered that William had been selling illegal weapons to both settlers and native tribes, fueling conflicts to drive down land prices. The deeds were hidden to keep the land from falling into his hands. Elizabeth placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder, sensing the dangerous territory they were entering. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion elsewhere," she suggested. "This place has been sealed for too long to be healthy." As they emerged from the cellar into the winter afternoon light, they discovered that word had spread. A larger group from town had gathered at the edge of the property, including Sheriff Malcolm Reed and, most concerning, Clayton Harlan, great-grandson of William Harlan and current mayor of the expanded settlement. "What exactly is happening here?" Clayton demanded, his imposing figure blocking their path back to town. "I've been told that trespassing on abandoned property has led to wild claims about my family's honor." Dr. Covington stepped forward, the lead box and its contents secured in his medical bag. "Mr. Harlan, what we've discovered requires careful consideration and private discussion. I suggest we adjourn to more appropriate surroundings." "I suggest you explain yourselves now," Clayton countered, his hand resting meaningfully on the pistol at his hip. Thomas, who had been silent since emerging into the daylight, suddenly straightened and looked directly at Clayton Harlan with an expression no child his age should possess, one of recognition and ancient judgment. "Your great-grandfather ordered James Woodford's death on December 15, 1749, then claimed grief when the body was discovered," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly in the winter air. "He built this town on stolen ambition and called it progress." A shocked murmur ran through the gathered crowd. Clayton Harlan's face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. The boy is either ill or has been coached to spread lies." Sheriff Reed, a deliberative man who had served the county for 15 years, raised his hands for calm. "Serious matters require serious consideration," he announced. "I propose we reconvene tomorrow at the town hall, where all parties can present their understanding in a civilized manner." As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, Elizabeth drew Thomas close, feeling his small body trembling against her. The excitement had drained from him, leaving exhaustion in its wake. "Are you all right?" she whispered. Thomas looked up at her, and for a moment she saw only her 8-year-old son, confused and frightened by forces beyond his control. "The memories are getting stronger," he admitted. "Sometimes I can't tell which thoughts are mine and which are his. Mother, I'm afraid of what happens next." Dr. Covington, who had overheard, placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "What happens next, Thomas, is that we approach this methodically. Science demands evidence and careful analysis, not hasty conclusions." As they walked back toward town, Elizabeth noticed that the doctor kept glancing back at the abandoned plantation, his expression troubled. "What is it?" she finally asked. "The lead box and documents are exactly where and what Thomas said they would be," he replied quietly, "which means we must consider the possibility that everything else he remembers is equally accurate." "Including William Harlan's involvement in James Woodford's death?" The doctor nodded grimly. "History is written by those who survive, Mrs. Farrow. Sometimes the dead find other ways to speak their truth." Morning arrived with a thin layer of frost glazing the windows of the Farrow cabin and a tension that seemed to crystallize the very air of Harlan's Creek. The town hall meeting called by Sheriff Reed was scheduled for noon, but by mid-morning, the simple clapboard building at the center of town was already surrounded by residents eager to witness the confrontation between young Thomas Farrow's inexplicable memories and the established history upon which their community was built. Elizabeth dressed Thomas with particular care, brushing his hair and straightening his collar as if preparing him for Sunday service rather than public scrutiny. The boy had slept fitfully, crying out several times during the night, caught in dreams that moved between centuries. "Do you want to talk about what you saw in your sleep?" she asked gently. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "I saw how it happened. James was returning from Cumberland Gap when 3 men stopped him on the forest road. They demanded the deeds, but he refused to tell them where they were hidden. One of them," his voice caught, "one of them had a knife with a silver handle, William Harlan's knife. James recognized it even in the dark. Elizabeth knelt before her son, taking his small hands in hers. "Thomas, today will be difficult. People may say unkind things or ask questions that upset you. You don't have to answer anything that frightens you." The boy's eyes, so young yet carrying such ancient knowledge, met hers steadily. "The truth matters, Mother. James died protecting it. I can't stop now." A knock at their door announced Dr. Covington's arrival. The physician had spent the night examining the documents from the lead box, comparing the handwriting with known samples of James Woodford's signature from county records. His face showed the effects of his sleepless research. "The documents are authentic," he confirmed. "The deeds, the letter, they're consistent with other records from that period. And there's more. I found court testimony from 1750 where William Harlan claimed under oath that he had last seen Woodford 3 days before the murder, when in fact, according to Thomas's or James's account, Harlan had dispatched men to intercept him. The town hall was overcrowded and uncomfortably warm by the time they arrived. Sheriff Reed had arranged chairs at the front of the room for the principal participants, Thomas and Elizabeth Farrow on one side, Clayton Harlan and his eldest son on the other. Dr. Covington was given a place between them, representing the scientific investigation of the matter. Reverend Wright sat slightly apart, his Bible open on his lap, though his eyes rarely left young Thomas's face. Sheriff Reed called the gathering to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. "We are here to consider extraordinary claims and evidence that have emerged regarding the founding history of our community," he announced. "This is not a trial, but a search for understanding. Dr. Covington will present what has been discovered, after which all parties will have an opportunity to speak." The doctor rose, holding the lead box and its contents carefully in his hands. With methodical precision, he described the discovery of the hidden cellar entrance, the location of the key, and the sealed documents preserved for a century. "These materials confirm parts of Thomas Farrow's account that he could not possibly have known through conventional means," Dr. Covington concluded. "They raise questions about historical events that may require us to reconsider our understanding of how Harlan's Creek came to be established." Clayton Harlan rose before the doctor had finished speaking. "This is preposterous," he exclaimed, his face flushed with indignation. "A child's fantasy, elaborated by adults with unclear motives, cannot overturn a century of documented history. My great-grandfather was a pillar of early Kentucky society, a man who brought civilization to this wilderness." "No one disputes William Harlan's contributions to the settlement," Sheriff Reed interjected calmly. "The question before us concerns specific events surrounding James Woodford's death and the subsequent acquisition of territories documented in these newly discovered deeds. Territories that mysteriously came into Harlan's possession shortly after Woodford's murder," Dr. Covington added quietly. The crowd murmured, some nodding in thoughtful agreement, others shaking their heads in dismissal. "The boy should speak," someone called from the back of the hall. "Let us hear directly from him." All eyes turned to Thomas, who sat small and still beside his mother. Elizabeth squeezed his hand reassuringly, but her heart raced with apprehension. Sheriff Reed nodded encouragingly. "Thomas, would you be willing to tell us what you remember about James Woodford's final days?" The boy stood, his face pale but composed. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the hushed room, its childish timbre at odds with the measured cadence of his words. James Woodford returned from Philadelphia in November of 1749, with deeds confirming his ownership of lands beyond the Cumberland Gap. William Harlan, who had invested in the expedition but not traveled east himself, immediately offered to buy the territories. When James refused, explaining that he intended to establish a new settlement for families seeking religious freedom, Harlan became increasingly hostile. Thomas paused, closing his eyes briefly as if consulting an internal record. On December 10th, James discovered documents in Harlan's office proving he had been selling weapons to both settlers and native tribes, creating conflicts that drove down land prices throughout the region. Confronted with this evidence, Harlan threatened James's family. Fearing for their safety, James hid the deeds and wrote a letter explaining the situation, intending to travel to Williamsburg to report Harlan's activities to colonial authorities. The boy's voice faltered slightly. "He never made it." On December 15th, 3 men intercepted him in the forest 5 miles east of the settlement. They demanded the deeds, but James refused, knowing what Harlan intended to do with the land. The man with the silver-handled knife struck first. As James lay dying, William Harlan emerged from the shadows to search his belongings for the documents, but found nothing. A profound silence fell over the town hall. Thomas stood unwavering, his small shoulders squared despite the weight of the century-old memory he had just recounted. Clayton Harlan rose to his feet, his face now ashen rather than flushed. "This is slander of the most vicious kind. There is no proof that my ancestor was even present at Woodford's death, let alone responsible for it." "There is one piece of evidence that might confirm or refute the boy's account," Dr. Covington interjected, his tone measured. According to county records, William Harlan owned a distinctive hunting knife with a silver handle, engraved with his initials. That knife was reportedly lost in the winter of 1749. Sheriff Reed leaned forward, suddenly alert. "What are you suggesting, Doctor?" "I'm suggesting that if James Woodford was indeed killed with that knife, and if the knife remained with the body, then excavation of the Woodford grave might provide physical evidence to support or contradict Thomas's recollection." The suggestion sent a ripple of shock through the assembly. Disturbing a grave was no small matter in a God-fearing community. Reverend Wright closed his Bible deliberately. "While I share concerns about such a step, I believe we must pursue truth wherever it leads us. If we proceed with proper respect and documentation, the examination of James Woodford's remains might put this matter to rest once and for all." Clayton Harlan, recognizing the turning tide, changed tactics. "Even if such a knife were found, which I doubt it would be, it proves nothing except that my ancestor's stolen property was used in a crime he had no part in." It was at this moment that an elderly man rose slowly from his seat at the back of the hall. Josiah Turner was 93 years old, the oldest resident of Harlan's Creek and a living connection to its earliest days. "I have sat silent too long," he announced, his voice quavering but determined. "My grandfather was one of the men who found James Woodford's body. He told me something that wasn't recorded in any official account, that clutched in Woodford's dead hand were strands of gray hair matching the distinctive color of William Harlan's. In his final moments, it seems Woodford fought back against his killer." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Clayton Harlan sank back into his chair, speechless. "I believe," Sheriff Reed said into the stunned silence, "that we have sufficient cause to investigate this matter thoroughly. I hereby authorize the careful exhumation of James Woodford's remains, to be conducted tomorrow under the supervision of Dr. Covington, with Reverend Wright present to ensure proper respect is maintained." As the meeting dispersed, Thomas turned to his mother, his eyes brimming with emotion that seemed beyond his years. "He just wanted justice," the boy whispered. "All these years waiting to be heard." Elizabeth embraced her son, feeling both fierce protection and quiet awe at what was unfolding through him. "And through you, he finally has a voice." As they left the town hall, Thomas suddenly stopped and looked directly at a man standing in the crowd, a stranger Elizabeth hadn't noticed before, watching them with intense interest. "Who is that?" she asked quietly. "Professor James Williamson," Dr. Covington supplied, following their gaze. "He arrived from Philadelphia yesterday, a researcher in psychological phenomena at the university." The stranger approached them, his manner courteous but eager. "Mrs. Farrow, Dr. Covington," he greeted them, then knelt to Thomas's eye level. "And you must be Thomas. I've heard remarkable things about your experience." "What brings you to our small town, Professor?" Elizabeth asked, instinctively drawing Thomas closer. "I study cases like your son's, children with memories that cannot be explained by conventional means. They're rare but documented across cultures and throughout history." He straightened, addressing both Elizabeth and the doctor. "What's happening here could be of immense significance to our understanding of human consciousness." Before Elizabeth could respond, Thomas spoke directly to the professor. "You're thinking about Emily Watson from Virginia in 1837 and Robert Collins from Massachusetts in 1842, he said matter-of-factly. They remembered past lives too, but nobody believed them because there wasn't evidence like the lead box. Professor Williamson stared at the boy, astonishment evident on his scholarly features. How could you possibly know about those cases? They're documented only in my private research journals. I don't know, Thomas admitted. Sometimes I just know things I shouldn't. It's been happening more since James's memories started coming back. This conversation, taking place in the middle of the street with curious onlookers gathering, made Elizabeth uncomfortable. Perhaps we could continue this discussion somewhere more private, she suggested. Of course, the professor agreed. I would very much like to document Thomas's experience with your permission. There may be others like him, struggling to understand memories that don't belong to their current lives. If you've been touched by Thomas's struggle to reconcile the memories of two souls occupying one body, leave a comment sharing what you would do if you suddenly recalled a past life. Would you seek evidence like Thomas has, or would you try to forget? Your responses help us understand how these stories resonate with each of you. Dawn broke cold and clear over Harlan's Creek the next day, illuminating a somber procession making its way to the old cemetery where James Woodford had been laid to rest a century before. Sheriff Reed led the way, followed by Dr. Covington and his assistant carrying necessary equipment. Reverend Wright walked behind them, prayer book in hand, his expression reflecting both religious concern and scientific curiosity. Elizabeth had initially planned to leave Thomas at home under the watchful eye of Sarah McDonough, but the boy had been adamant. I need to be there, he insisted with quiet determination. James needs me to witness this. And so mother and son joined the procession, along with Professor Williamson, who had spent the previous evening documenting Thomas's recollections in meticulous detail. Clayton Harlan and several town elders completed the group, the former's presence mandated by the sheriff to ensure transparency in the proceedings. James Woodford's grave was marked by a simple headstone of local limestone, weathered by 100 Kentucky winters but still legible. James Woodford, 1709-1749, Seeker of Truth. The grave was located beneath a towering oak tree, whose bare winter branches seemed to reach protectively over the final resting place. Thomas approached the headstone slowly, reaching out to trace the carved letters with his fingertips. His wife chose these words, he said softly. She knew what mattered most to him. The exhumation proceeded with solemn care under Dr. Covington's direction. When the diggers' shovels finally struck wood, a hush fell over the assembled witnesses. The century-old coffin was carefully raised and placed on a prepared tarp beside the grave. Its wood was deteriorated but largely intact, protected by the region's clay soil. Dr. Covington knelt beside the coffin, tools ready. I will now open the casket to examine the remains, he announced formally. Reverend Wright, will you offer a prayer before we proceed? The Reverend stepped forward, his prayer brief but heartfelt, acknowledging both the unusual circumstances and the respect due to the deceased. When he finished, Dr. Covington carefully began removing the coffin lid, which came away in pieces, revealing the skeletal remains of James Woodford. Despite the passage of a century, certain items had been preserved alongside the bones. Fragments of clothing, leather boots, a pocket watch stopped at 417, and most significantly, a knife with a tarnished silver handle, its blade embedded in the ribcage where it had ended James Woodford's life 100 years before. Doctor. Covington carefully extracted the weapon, holding it up to the winter light. Even through the tarnish, an ornate WH was visible on the handle. William Harlan's knife, Sheriff Reed confirmed grimly. Just as the boy described. Clayton Harlan stood rigid, his face a mask of shock and denial. This proves nothing conclusive. The knife could have been stolen, used by another hand. There's more, Dr. Covington said, gently examining the skeletal hands. The right hand appears to be clutching something. With delicate precision, he opened the preserved fingers to reveal several strands of gray hair, preserved by the unique conditions of the burial. Professor Williamson moved closer, his academic interest overcoming the somber nature of the moment. This is extraordinary corroboration. The physical evidence matches Thomas's account exactly. Thomas had been standing silently beside his mother, but now he stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the remains. When he spoke, his voice carried a quality that made the adults fall silent, a tone of recognition and completion. "Now you can rest," he said simply to the skeleton. "The truth is known." As if responding to the boy's words, a sudden gust of wind swept through the cemetery, rustling the bare branches of the oak tree. Several of those present would later swear they felt something intangible shift in that moment, a century-old burden finally lifting. Sheriff Reed cleared his throat, breaking the spell of the moment. "Based on this evidence, I believe the historical record regarding James Woodford's death must be amended. As for legal consequences," he glanced at Clayton Harlan, "while we cannot prosecute crimes committed a century ago, the rightful ownership of certain properties may need to be reconsidered in light of these discoveries." Clayton Harlan, facing the undeniable evidence of his ancestors' crime, seemed to age before their eyes. "My family has built this town, contributed to its growth for generations," he said, his voice lacking its usual force. "Must the sins of the founder taint all that came after?" Reverend Wright stepped forward, his expression compassionate despite the grim discoveries. "The scripture teaches us that truth brings freedom, even when that truth is difficult to bear. Your family's contributions to this community are real, Mr. Harlan, but they cannot stand on a foundation of hidden murder and theft. Acknowledgement and restitution must come first." As the remains were respectfully returned to the earth, the implications of the morning's discoveries rippled outward. Professor Williamson had documented everything, his scholarly detachment giving way to genuine wonder at the verification of Thomas's impossible memories. Dr. Covington had preserved the knife and hair as evidence, though what court would ever hear a case opened after a century remained uncertain. Elizabeth watched her son throughout the proceedings, noting how he stood straighter than before, as if relieved of an invisible weight. As they walked home through the frost-covered fields, she finally asked the question that had been growing in her mind. "Thomas, now that James's truth has been revealed, what happens to his memories? Will they stay with you?" The boy was quiet for several moments, considering. "They feel different now," he finally said. "Less urgent, like they're settling into a different part of me." He looked up at her, his eyes reflecting a wisdom beyond his years, but also a child's vulnerability. "I think I needed to help him find justice. Now that it's done, maybe I can just be Thomas again. But I'll always remember being James, too." That evening, as word of the morning's discoveries spread throughout Harlan's Creek, Professor Williamson joined the Farrows for dinner, his notebook never far from hand. The academic's initial scientific interest had evolved into something more profound, a recognition that Thomas's case challenged the very boundaries of human consciousness and identity. There have been documented cases of children with memories that appear to transcend their lifetimes, he explained, but never one with such extensive verification. The implications are, well, they're revolutionary. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked, concerned less with scientific implications than with her son's well-being. "With your permission, I would like to document Thomas's case thoroughly for scientific study. It could help us understand other children who experience similar phenomena." The professor hesitated before adding, "And it might help Thomas himself integrate these dual memories in a healthy way." Thomas, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "James would want his story told," he said with certainty. "And maybe it will help others who remember things they shouldn't." Later that night, after the professor had departed and Thomas had gone to bed, Elizabeth sat alone by the fire, contemplating the extraordinary events that had transformed their lives. Her son was still her son, but he carried something ancient and additional within him, memories that had bridged a century to find voice and justice. Outside, the winter night was clear and star-filled, a crescent moon casting silver light over Harlan's Creek. In the distance stood the abandoned Woodford plantation, its dark silhouette somehow less forbidding than before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, legal questions about land ownership, the community's adjustment to revised history, and the continuing mystery of Thomas's dual consciousness. But for tonight, there was a sense of completion, of a circle closing after 100 years of patient waiting, Elizabeth gazed into the dying embers, wondering what other unfinished stories might be waiting for their moment of resolution, and what role her extraordinary son might yet play in bringing forgotten truths to light. Spring arrived early in Kentucky that year, as if the land itself was eager to shed the weight of winter and secrets long buried. The countryside around Harlan's Creek transformed from frost-covered dormancy to vibrant green, mirroring the community's own awakening to a revised understanding of its history. In the 3 months since the exhumation of James Woodford's remains, much had changed in the small settlement. Clayton Harlan, unable to deny the evidence of his ancestors' crimes, had withdrawn from public life. The town council, after weeks of deliberation, had voted to establish a trust to manage the disputed territories, lands that rightfully belonged to James Woodford's descendants, but had benefited the entire community for generations. Elizabeth Farrow had received numerous offers to sell their story to newspapers as far away as New York and Boston, but she had declined them all, protective of her son's privacy and concerned about the wider implications of his experiences. Professor Williamson had returned to Philadelphia, but maintained regular correspondence, sending updates on his research into other cases of children with inexplicable historical memories. Most significantly, Thomas himself had changed. The urgent, almost desperate quality that had characterized his recollections of James Woodford's life had subsided. The memories remained, but they had integrated more naturally into his consciousness, less intrusive but permanently part of him. He had returned to school, where his teachers noted both his restored focus on childhood concerns and occasional insights that reflected wisdom far beyond his years. On a warm April afternoon, as new leaves unfurled on the oak tree outside their cabin, Elizabeth watched Thomas playing with the neighbors' children, running, laughing, engaged in the simple joys of youth. Dr. Covington, who had continued to monitor the boy's well-being, joined her on the porch. "He seems to have found balance," the doctor observed. "The memories of James Woodford are still there, but they no longer overwhelm him." Elizabeth nodded, relief evident in her expression. "He's my Thomas again, but with something extra, a depth that's hard to explain. He told me last night that he feels like he has 2 sets of wisdom to draw from now." "And the nightmares?" "Gone since the day we found the knife. It's as if James finally found his peace." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a carriage bearing the distinguished figure of Judge Nathaniel Prescott from the county seat. The judge, a man known for his strict adherence to legal procedure, had been surprisingly open-minded about the Woodford case, perhaps influenced by the irrefutable physical evidence. "Mrs. Farrow," he greeted her formally, removing his hat. "Dr. Covington, I've come to inform you that the legal proceedings regarding the Woodford-Harlan territories have been concluded." Elizabeth invited him to join them on the porch, where he produced several official documents from his leather portfolio. "The court has recognized the validity of James Woodford's original deeds," he explained. "However, given the complex history and the century of development that has occurred, we've established a compromise that I believe honors justice while acknowledging practical realities." The solution was elegant in its balance. The Woodford family, represented now by distant relatives located through court researchers, would receive formal recognition and financial compensation for the stolen lands. Existing settlements would remain undisturbed, but a portion of tax revenues from the territories would permanently fund educational opportunities for both settler and native children in the region, honoring James Woodford's original vision for the land. Additionally, the judge continued, his tone softening slightly, the County Historical Society wishes to properly document James Woodford's contributions to early Kentucky settlement. They would like to interview young Thomas about his unique insights. At the mention of his name, Thomas abandoned his game and joined them on the porch, his expression curious, but no longer burdened by the weight of unresolved justice. "Would you be willing to share what you remember of James Woodford's vision for this land?" Judge Prescott asked, addressing the boy directly and with genuine respect. Thomas considered the question carefully. He believed this territory could be a place where different peoples lived according to their own traditions, but in harmony with each other, he replied, his childish voice carrying the conviction of a man who had indeed held such a vision. The violence between settlers and tribes pained him deeply, That's why he negotiated directly with Cherokee leaders rather than simply claiming their hunting grounds. The judge nodded thoughtfully. A progressive view for 1749. Perhaps one we might still learn from today. After the judge departed, Thomas remained on the porch, watching the distant hills with an expression that suggested he was seeing both the present landscape and memories of how it had appeared a century earlier. "What are you thinking about?" Elizabeth asked gently. "I was remembering how James felt the first time he saw these hills," Thomas replied. "He thought they were the most beautiful sight in the world, like God had created them specifically as a refuge for people seeking peace." The boy turned to his mother, his expression reflective. "It's strange to miss a place you're standing in, but sometimes I do. I miss how it was before all the changes." Dr. Covington, who had remained silent during the judge's visit, leaned forward with professional interest. "Thomas, may I ask you something about how these dual memories feel to you now?" The boy nodded, accustomed to the doctor's questions after months of careful observation. "Do you still feel that you are both Thomas and James, or has that sensation changed?" Thomas considered this carefully, with the seriousness he brought to all discussions of his unique condition. "It's more like I'm Thomas who also remembers being James," he finally said. "Like how you might remember being a younger version of yourself, except the younger version was a different person entirely." He frowned slightly at the inadequacy of his explanation. "The memories are still clear, but they feel more like something I'm carrying for him rather than something I am." Later that evening, as twilight softened the Kentucky landscape, Thomas asked his mother if they could visit the old Woodford plantation. They hadn't returned since the day of the exhumation, and Elizabeth was surprised by the request. "Are you sure? There's nothing left to discover there." "I know," Thomas said, "but I'd like to say goodbye properly." They walked together through the greening fields, the spring air fragrant with wildflowers and new growth. The abandoned plantation house stood as it had for decades, weathered and empty, but somehow less forlorn in the gentle evening light. Thomas led the way to a spot behind the house, near where they had discovered the cellar entrance months before. A wild rose bush, dormant during their winter visit, now showed the first buds of spring growth. "Sarah planted this on their first anniversary," Thomas explained, referring to James Woodford's wife. "She brought the cutting from her family's garden in Virginia. James promised her that someday it would grow into something beautiful that would outlast both of them." The boy knelt beside the ancient plant, touching one of the green buds gently. He was right. Elizabeth watched her son's communion with this living link to the past, understanding that such moments of connection were part of his healing process. The impossible memory that had erupted into their lives that January morning had forever changed them both, expanding their understanding of life's mysteries and the persistence of truth across time. As they turned to leave, Thomas paused for one final look at the abandoned home. "Thank you," he whispered, his words carried away by the evening breeze. Whether he was thanking James Woodford for the shared memories or expressing gratitude for the burden finally lifted, Elizabeth couldn't tell, but the peace in her son's face told her all she needed to know. 5 years passed, transforming Harlan's Creek into a community reconciled with its complex origins. The settlement, formally renamed Woodford Creek in 1851 to acknowledge historical truth, had grown modestly but purposefully. The schoolhouse, expanded using funds from the Woodford Trust, now welcomed children from surrounding farms and nearby native settlements alike, embodying the inclusive vision James Woodford had held for the territory. Thomas Farrow, now 13, had developed into a thoughtful young man whose unusual dual perspective had shaped him in remarkable ways. The integration of James Woodford's memories, while still a scientific mystery that periodically brought researchers and spiritualists to their door, had settled into a manageable aspect of his identity, neither overwhelming nor forgotten. On a crisp autumn morning in 1854, Thomas sat at the desk in his room, carefully writing in a leather-bound journal, the latest of several volumes in which he had documented the memories and insights that continued to surface. Professor Williamson, who maintained regular correspondence, had encouraged this practice as both therapeutic and historically valuable. Elizabeth knocked softly on the open door, momentarily struck by how the morning light illuminated her son's profile, highlighting features that somehow seemed to carry echoes of the portrait of James Woodford that now hung in the town hall. "The carriage will be here soon," she reminded him. "Are you nearly ready?" Thomas nodded, closing his journal. "Just finishing my thoughts about today's ceremony." The occasion was significant. The dedication of a memorial to both the original settlers of the region and the native peoples who had first inhabited the land. The monument had been commissioned using funds from the Woodford Trust, designed to acknowledge the complex history of the territory and the ideals of coexistence that had been cut short by violence a century before. As they traveled to the ceremony site, a meadow where the boundaries of former tribal lands and settler claims had once met, Thomas gazed out the carriage window at the autumn landscape, his expression contemplative. "What are you thinking?" Elizabeth asked, a question that had become a gentle invitation for Thomas to share the unique perspective he carried. "I was thinking about how James would feel, seeing his vision partially realized after all this time," he replied. "There's still conflict, still misunderstanding, but there's also genuine effort to create something better." He turned to her, his young face reflecting wisdom acquired rather than inherited. "And I was thinking that memory might be the most powerful force we possess. Not just our own memories, but the ones we carry for others, the truths that refuse to be buried." The dedication ceremony brought together diverse representatives of the community, descendants of early settlers, members of Cherokee and Shawnee tribes whose ancestors had hunted these lands, county officials, and ordinary citizens curious about this new acknowledgement of their shared history. Judge Prescott, now retired but still influential, had traveled from the county seat to deliver the principal address. As the elderly judge spoke about reconciliation and historical truth, Thomas found himself scanning the assembled crowd. Most faces reflected interest or approval, but a few showed lingering discomfort with the revised narrative of their community's founding. Among them was William Harlan, Clayton's son, who had struggled to rebuild his family's standing after the revelations about his great-great-grandfather's crimes. The younger Harlan had chosen a different path from his father's bitter withdrawal. After months of private contemplation, he had publicly acknowledged his ancestors' wrongdoing and committed to making amends through dedicated service to the community. Today, his presence at the ceremony represented another step in that difficult journey. When the formal speeches concluded and the memorial stone was unveiled, bearing inscriptions in English and Cherokee that honored all who had lived and died in the pursuit of this territory's promise, Thomas was unexpectedly invited forward. "We have among us someone with a unique connection to our shared history," Judge Prescott announced. "Thomas Farrow, whose extraordinary insights helped restore truth to our community's founding story, has been asked to offer the closing reflection." Thomas had been forewarned about this request, but still felt a flutter of nervousness as he stood before the gathered crowd. At 13, he was no longer the confused child who had awakened with another man's memories, but neither was he fully comfortable with public attention. Taking a deep breath, he spoke from the heart, or perhaps from two hearts that had somehow learned to beat in harmony. 105 years ago, James Woodford stood on this very ground and imagined a future where different peoples might live together in mutual respect, learning from one another's strengths and traditions. His dream was cut short by violence born of greed, and the truth of that violence was buried alongside him for a century. Thomas paused, his gaze sweeping across the diverse faces before him. But truth has a persistence that transcends time. It waits patiently, sometimes for generations, until the moment comes for it to emerge into light. The question before us now is what we build with that truth, whether we use it to divide us through blame and shame, or to unite us in creating something better than what came before. As he concluded his brief remarks, Thomas felt a subtle shift within himself, a sense of completion, as if James Woodford's persistent memory had finally found its purpose and could now truly rest. The boy who had carried a dead man's burden had helped transform that burden into a living legacy. The years that followed brought continued growth for both Thomas and the renamed settlement. Elizabeth Farrow, with financial support from the Woodford Trust, established a small printing press that published educational materials and historical accounts, ensuring that revised understandings of the region's past would be preserved for future generations. Dr. Covington's careful documentation of Thomas's case contributed to emerging scientific discussions about consciousness and memory, challenging conventional boundaries of identity and experience. Thomas himself grew into a young man whose unique perspective bridged not just centuries, but cultures. His formal education, supplemented by the wisdom of James Woodford's memories, prepared him for an unconventional path. By his 20th birthday, he had become a respected mediator in territorial disputes throughout Kentucky and neighboring states, his dual consciousness giving him an unusual capacity to understand opposing viewpoints and find common ground. On a warm summer evening in 1861, as rumors of national conflict grew more ominous, Thomas stood on the porch of the home he now shared with his mother and his wife, Sarah, named by coincidence or fate after James Woodford's beloved spouse. The sunset painted the hills in gold and amber, much as they had appeared to James Woodford's eyes over a century before. "Do you still feel him with you?" Sarah asked, joining him at the railing. Thomas considered the question carefully. "Not as I once did," he admitted. "The memories remain, but they've become part of me rather than something separate. It's like reading a beloved book so many times that its stories become woven into your own experience." He smiled, watching the fading light transform the landscape. "But in moments like this, I can almost feel him looking through my eyes, seeing what became of the place he loved." As darkness fell over Woodford Creek, lights appeared in windows throughout the settlement. Homes built on land that had once been contested, now inhabited by families who had learned, however imperfectly, to acknowledge their complex shared history. The community that had grown from revealed truth rather than comfortable fiction stood as testament to the power of memory to transcend time, seeking justice and understanding across the boundaries of life and death themselves. Thomas Farrow, the boy who woke with another man's memories, had helped shape a future that James Woodford could never have experienced but had dared to imagine. A legacy of truth that, once unearthed, had transformed not just a settlement's name, but its very soul. If you've watched this far, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far, so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel." And if this exploration of memory, justice, and historical truth resonated with you, please like and share it with others who appreciate stories that bridge the boundaries between past and present. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more compelling historical narratives that reveal the hidden truths buried just beneath the surface of the history we think we know.